Welcome back to Oratio Podium, where we discuss and celebrate the art of public speaking and debating as a journey and experiences of different individual speakers and also stalwarts from the field. You are listening to an episode of Debating Diaries. We have with us on board Pranav Anand, who is a notable figure in debating and has an experience spanning different countries across the globe. Pranav is a distinguished figure in competitive debating. He has left his mark in multiple formats, including and not restricted to British Parliamentary 3v3 and World Schools Debate Championship circuits. His expertise also spans as a speaker, judge, debate coach, and chief adjudicator at various prestigious tournaments worldwide. As a DCA, he has significantly shaped competitions like the NAUDC 2024 and Princeton IV, and his judging credentials also include breaks at different international tournaments like the WDC and adjudicating finals at several prestigious tournaments as well, like Australs and Trinity. At Yale, he also achieved the rare distinction of breaking as a speaker and serving as a final judge on his attempts in this competition. But that's just not all. In WSDC circuit, Pranav has demonstrated his coaching prowess by leading teams like the UAE and Taiwan into national triumphs and also breaking at the World Schools Debating Championship. But he has also worked in other spaces in this field, including as a judging force in, say, Harvard WSDC finals. His multifaceted experience is something which would definitely resonate with our listeners and help them guide them through their various journeys as well. And consistent success that he has achieved in different debate formats would definitely be a very, very interesting thing for conversations with different factors. Welcome, Pranav, to the podcast. Would you like to say a few words about yourself and what you're doing currently?
Yeah, hi. So I guess you covered most of it, maybe more like with nicer than I probably would have. I guess currently I can say, I mean, recently, I guess debating wise, the last major thing I did was I was a DCA for Vienna Pre WUDC. So that's the competition prior to Sofia. It's usually the main prep com for it. Not Sofia, this was Panama World, sorry. That just happens this December. And right now, I'm kind of just like planning out what my February schedule looks like. I'm based out of Atlanta. I work as a data analyst for the state government here. Um, yeah, and I guess that's where I'm at currently.
It's a very interesting thing, right? Because you've taken up data analytics after, say, completing debating, but it also gives you a very diverse perspective.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I took it up with my master's program. So that started in like 2021. Well, technically I got in at 2020, but because of the pandemic, I delayed it by a year. So I guess sort of my like foray into debating and it becoming a bigger part of my life again. Because the first time was when I was in schools. So the second time coincided with when I was also foraying into data analytics. Um, but honestly, what's surprising to note is that it's a fairly common confluence. Like there are many people I know who do both data analytics or maybe like it's like computer science or something more intense, as well as like do debating on the side. I don't know. I guess for some people it just like tickles different parts of their brains, and that happens to be common.
Something very interesting stood out from that conversation as well, right? You said that you started debating in school, but I've also known that you've debated across different regions in various international tournaments. So, if you're looking back in your journey, what really made you start?
Well, this I'll actually have to give credit to my mom. Although I don't know if it's like I don't know if the way she did it is a way I would recommend others to get in. It just happened to work for me. So I've told this story before, but in brief, what happened was that in high school, I grew up in Dubai, so that's where it started for me. In like seventh or eighth grade, I was generally a pretty shy kid at around that time. Um, which is surprising, I guess. So most people who know me now, I'm a little too talkative, probably. But at that time, what happened was that my mom, she really was like trying to get me to open up, and her solution was to sort of try to enroll me for World Scholars Cup, which at the time was a competition. It still exists, but like at the time was a competition that sort of does like part essay writing, part quizzes, part debate on like a variety of pre-existing topics you have to study. And she basically have to form teams of three, and she told me that I have to sign up for a team of three. I lied to her and I said that I'd formed a team of three. I had no plan. I don't know why I lied to her, but I did not sign a team of three because I was like so scared of trying to find people to ask in my grade in school. And so she sort of found out on the day off that I had not signed up a team of three. And while I think most parents would have probably just like shouted at me and like, got along with their day, she took me that weekend. She sort of dragged me to the school campus where it was happening, dropped me there, and sort of just said, well, you're going to figure it out. And so she sort of forced me to go up to the teacher and ask if I could, on the day off, have like be part of a team of three, which is difficult because like registration deadlines had ended a while ago. I got very lucky that there was a team for which one of the teammates had just happened to drop out and I got signed in. But what ended up happening as a result was that even though there was a lot of animosity around that time between me and my mom, I surprisingly did rather well at the competition, especially considering I had studied none of the pre-existing materials. I think I'd actually even like got a medal position in the debate competition, and that kind of started on my journey of like joining my club. Like I got very lucky. My high school at the time was reasonably well known for debating, and so I sort of just joined the debating society and ended up like going to India for some competitions, and then I later joined the WSDC circuit where I got selected in my final year to be part of the UAE national team.
So you also mentioned that you were around in Dubai, you were also around in, say, India a couple of times. So what has made you go across these countries, and what have you approached these countries with? Because I'm pretty sure there would be some cultural or regional differences. So have you noticed any of them?
So I guess this question changes depending on what time period you're talking about. So when I was growing up in 2015, or well, I would say like 2012 to 2014, it was very different. um the main thing was, so the reason we would end up going to Indian debate competitions is because my school in Dubai was still like pretty much an Indian curriculum. So I did the ISC and ICSE curriculums. So we would often travel to India, like semi often travel to India. Um at the time, the differences in the like debating society, in the debating cultures, were very, very like stark. So Dubai's debating culture was very nascent. It usually was like maybe a handful of schools that was kind of informally organized or collectivized together by like this one guy called Grant Smith, who was originally from Australia, but at the time ran Jumeirah College's debate society, which was probably the best debating society at the time in UAE. And so it was kind of a little bit more informal. It also was a lot more insular. There were only a few debating societies jostling for position. At the time when I was there, the school I was a part of, now it's called James Morat Academy. At the time, it was Dubai Morat, and I was probably like third or fourth on that list. So it wasn't as good as, say, JC or Dubai College DC. Um, but basically, what that also meant was that it was kind of decided by what Grant Smith wanted. And thankfully, he was, for the most part, a fairly reasonable caretaker, which means that there was a high emphasis on rules of logic when you were speaking, building up a reasonably coherent or constructive case when you were doing it. And that's, I think, because we were trying to a large extent to emulate success at the WSDC circuit, which, while I do think is still maybe excessively rhetorically oriented, still cared a lot about the basic rules of logic, refutation, and rebuttal and argumentation. At the time, however, the Indian debating societies that I would visit were very different. They were far, far more rhetorically oriented, almost like excessively so, by which I mean there was not very much emphasis on like being super logical or on like having arguments. So like when we would go for like debating competitions in India, frankly speaking, we would sort of just like crack jokes. We would sort of like write or even make up quotes from like big figures. There were just certain positions that you just could not take. So, like any attempt, for example, to take a position that contravenes, say, some quote by Mahatma Gandhi or Jawaharlal Nehru was like an absolute no-no. You just couldn't win against the teachers who were like judging you there, and it usually was teachers judging you. Like there was very much like obvious attempts to appeal to their pathos. The other major difference was the straight up formats that we used. So, like in Dubai, it was just mostly WSDC format. In the Indian competitions we went to, it was a wider variety. So you'd be like round robins. It would be like jams or like just a minute. So like be given a word, and you'd have to give an extempore speech for like a minute or two. Um, you know, you'd get a motion, for example, and you'd have a whole week to prepare for it before you enter it in the competition. So it was like a much wider diversity of formats in India. So that was very different, or almost like like we would sort of go to India competitions to like try and get the prestige or like get enough placements to take back home, but it was never like a big part of us trying to make it to the WSDC team. My understanding, to be very clear, of how the Indian debating program cultivated, because to be clear, at the time, the WSDC team for India was still doing reasonably well. But the way they would do it is sort of like they would pick the best students from the variety of nations, from like the variety of states or whatever. And those students maybe have grown up on like a pretty different diet in terms of debating culture. And then once they got selected, they would then go through a pretty rigorous training regimen with like some like I don't know, coaches or whatever, and would then be taught, I guess, the WSDC way, so to speak. So India's performance at the national level, while I don't think anywhere close to where it has been over the last couple of years, um, was still never bad. Like they would still more often than not break um to like octos or something like that. And that's because they would still do that training. But at the regional level, like on the school level, I would say it was very different, and not something that we probably liked or appreciated much.
You also mentioned that you've done debating across multiple formats, right? You mentioned round robin, you mentioned British parliamentary, and you also have done 3v3s and WSDC. So, when you journeyed across these styles, were you facing any challenges, and what do you think were the major things that you had to take into account when you were going through, say, one medium to the other?
So this answer will differ depending on whether we're talking about high school or whether we're talking about my more recent like university and post university experience. In high school, honestly, most of our focus was on WSDC, so like a version of 3v3 for those who don't know. And so we put most of our attention to that. We did do British parliamentary like once in a while, but those would usually be like, the occasional training in like a spar. Because to be very clear here, unlike today's debate, where I think there's a lot more like globalization of formats, in 2012, 2013, there was not. So there was no online debating. There was no like knowledge of other circuits very much beyond WSDC. So we never had like an interaction on what other formats would look like, which basically means we didn't have competitions. So like there wouldn't be like BP competitions we could really go for, like there is like over the last few years. So basic things like whatever the hell an extension was, we didn't give a damn about that. Like I don't know what the hell that was at that time. All we just cared about was like having a couple of basic arguments, running them, refuting the others that we could, and doing well with those. We would only learn about BP argumentation and extensions from WUDC because that was still prominent. And I guess, I mean, sadly, in a way, in hindsight, but like at the time, they still had a lot of decent videos coming out. So from there, we would understand that British parliamentary existed as a format, what motions were looking like there. But we never gave like a ton of attention to them beyond just watching whatever videos we could, because there were so few videos in general out there that whatever video we could get our hands on. And we would understand it from our coaches because our coaches would happen to be like pretty well versed in BP. So like the coaches for me in WSDC for like my year in WSDC were Bo and Finale, who won the 2016 Worlds round. So obviously we would have some awareness that BP existed and what it was, but it was never our focus. So format culture differences at the time were not that big a deal. In terms of like other formats that the Indian schools exposes to, so like I don't know, like just a minute or like round robin, they were there. We never really tried super hard to train for them. We would just occasionally train. We would try and do that. Very frankly speaking, it's because we couldn't take them seriously. In part, it wasn't just because they were very pathos oriented. It's also because, for better or worse, we perceived, and I think it's still, at least from my perspective, somewhat accurate perception that these were all these were kind of rigged games. So what I mean by this is like the host school, their team would always perform pretty damn well. In part because a significant percentage of the teachers were from the same school. In part because when you would perform in front of an audience, obviously most of the students were from their school. So it very much felt like, like we're never gonna win. We could pass place highly and do well. And I think we did okay. Like we made a couple of finals and stuff like that, but we never considered us that seriously. Occasionally we would practice something. So like just a minute, I remember like struggling for a while before I got the hang of it because I mean it's kind of weird, like you get a random word, you just have to like talk out of your butt, honestly, for like a couple of minutes on it with like 1 minute preparation time. And you'd have to try and make something that sounds coherent and constructive enough that it's still, I guess, entertaining or reasonable to judges. So like it took some time to get a hang of it. We'd have to practice a lot of words and stuff like that. I remember the competition for which I practiced for. I didn't actually play super highly in it, if I remember. Um, but It was fine, and we didn't match. Like, I was sort of put it out of mind after the competition. Like, maybe I'd be a bit sour and envious that I didn't do very well in it for like a couple of weeks. But then after that, we sort of just moved on. So yeah, most of our focus just WSDC.
But then, what do you think happened during the university time as well? Because I think you mentioned that there's this dichotomy, right? That in schools you felt differently about these changes and approaches to different formats. But what do you think university level would have meant when you were going through these formats?
Yeah. So the important clarification I should make here is that after high school, I had like a 6 year gap where I did almost no debating. This was not really by choice. At the time, debating was still very much like you got to get into the top few schools or universities in the US to compete. And if you didn't get into those top universities, there was basically no debating society to really talk about. So I was like at Emory University in my undergrad, which did not have any British parliamentary. It did not have any APTA format, which is also pretty popular in the United States. What they really did was like sort of like NSDA or like American debating, and that is very antithetical to what I like about debating. So what that is, if you for those who don't know, is like you get one very vague general topic and you debate that same topic throughout the year. So it'll be something like, I don't know, this out like we regret US invasions, and they'll talk about like we regret US invasions into XYZ, like five different types of nations or something like that. And then the idea is like you do a ton of research into what that like into like you pick whatever case you want to run on gov or on op. You do a lot of research, you construct a very dense case based on that research, and then your aim is sort of like in that speech, in the constructive speech you give, you sort of try and like wrap as fast as you can as many words of the case you've written out as you can. So it's almost like you're reading out the construct, like you're reading out the case as much as you can, and they're then like giving out an op pre-plep case as much as they can, and then there's sort of like interrogations. There's a term I'm forgetting for, but like they sort of like cross examination basically. So they cross examine it and they sort of give like responses to it. As someone who grew up on WSDC and BP, obviously super different, right? Like I'm not used to prepping one motion for the whole year. I'm not used to doing like huge amounts of research and like writing them up into like research papers that you would wrap at the speed of light, right? I much prefer like slower constructive arguments that you're creating in an hour or 30 minutes or however long. So I didn't do debate for like 6 years. And Emory, I think I tried to start like my own debating society for like parliamentary debate or something at the time. Um, I'm not gonna lie, it's kind of like a bit of an embarrassing venture. Let's just say it didn't work out. You had like pretty high limits to reach. You had like 13 members, so to constantly be part of it, and it was really hard to compete because Emory was pretty well known or pretty good at the other format, the American format. So that debating society obviously was like, look, mate, like we don't want to ensure that like none of our funding should go to you, obviously, because we want all that funding through we could go for competitions. So like we didn't get much institutional support from that, and I couldn't get anything going. So I tried for a year, kind of embarrassed. I gave up on it. I did like MUN instead for like 2.5 years, which I really enjoyed. Honestly, I know everyone like likes to rag on MUN, but like I liked it a lot. At least to be fair, I didn't do like GA. I did a lot of like crisis committees. I can explain that if you really want to, but it's a tangent. But the point is like I enjoyed doing that for 2.5 years. It came close to scratching the itch. I only came back in university debating with the pandemic. So with the pandemic, to be clear, sorry, this is a very long-winded explanation. But the point is that with the pandemic, um, everything sort of happened online. And then I suddenly realized that like a lot of people who are like doing very well in WDC and who are like placing high on tabs happen to for some reason be on the NA Spar group. Um, I'm really good friends with one of the people who was like essential to starting that and organizing it. Megandarpa. She's also in Atlanta, incidentally. But the point is that I kind of got in touch with her, and then I sort of would just like randomly spar in these. And this coincided with when I finished 1 year of working in Atlanta and I went back to Dubai because of the pandemic. 1 year in Dubai I had before I went back for my master. So I worked out of Dubai, and then in the nights or like in the early mornings, I'd like do debate spars over here. So that's when I came back into it. Uh, so I guess to actually come to your question now, which is what were these differences in formats looking like in university? Um, I think the main thing is I feel it didn't matter as much now, at least after having done this for a while. The differences in format were not as super relevant to me. I mean, I can give like some cursory list of differences. Like, for example, the WSDC format is still like a little bit more rhetorically focused, I think, than British parliamentary, which is much more caring about like mechanistic rigor and like dumping a lot of like arguments and stuff like that. I think recently there's been a more generally positive change towards again having a little bit more rhetoric, or at least slowing down and having a comprehensible style. Um, but I think that's also in part because, frankly speaking, the WSDC format just has worse judges in general. A lot of them are like pretty old teachers or like pretty old reppy people who've just been there in the circuit for like decades. Um, Other differences, like I think 3v3, for example, the format I love the most, which is generally 3v3, is I think the most like sound one because I feel most motions tend to be kind of shallow. And so like extensions in British parliamentary are kind of hard to come by. For those who don't know, like an extension is just basically like a new argument you have to give under the previous teams who came before you. But that argument has to be like independently winning, has to be independently new in some way, and that's kind of hard to do sometimes when motions just have like two or three arguments per side, which it shouldn't be in a good BP motion. But a lot of motions, I frankly think, just are because like CAPs are not doing a very good job of testing them or like, some unforeseen circumstances. Um, so some of these differences are there. Like I think, for example, as a judge, I probably have different preferences with regards to BP versus 3v3. Like 3v3 can sometimes be a bit difficult to judge because teams are just responding to each other continuously down the bench. And then it's very hard to figure out where things are ending up because most teams, when they respond, they really just are counter arguing a different reason. But I think it's very fun to speak. I really enjoy speaking in 3v3 because sometimes I can give a very clear, clarifying speech once you're giving like a second op or like a third gov speech, for example. And you don't have to worry as much about extensions in the same way. British parliamentary is like very logistically easier, is in a way logistically easier because many more teams can participate in a single room, right? And it's interesting because new novel arguments have to be introduced with extensions. So you can have a very interesting kind of depth. But also BP is a little bit more gamified versus 3v3, right? Because BP, sometimes you have to be very strategic, right? So you have to say, here's my extension, here are like three pieces of weighing above my own opening. So it's like very like meta debatory. Like, here's why my argument is more important than their argument. Whereas like 3v3 is a little bit more like, here is the argument itself. I will refute their argument. Like sometimes it feels like TBT involves talking about the content a little bit more than BP does. Whereas BP, it's not just about the content, but it's about placing the content in the debate. Um, so those are some of the differences. I really like them like in different ways. My experience is like 3v3 is really fun for debating. Judging, I don't think I have such a strong preference. Coaching, I just happen to do WSDC a lot more. I've done some BP coaching, but WSDC is just because like I have a affinity for the format because I grew up with it. I know a lot of friends in debating societies and a lot of kids, and I really enjoy coaching kids. So that's really enjoyable. Seeing, I don't have a very strong preference. I just happen to have done BP because that's where like most people do PP. I've also done some APTA, to be fair. I've done some judging. I judged at like ATS, which is the main APTA competition. But like, um, yeah, I there are differences. It's never been super important to me at this stage because I've done enough on most of them.
The other interesting factor around this discussion is that you have both spoken and judged pretty consistently in an international level. And you also mentioned that in certain interveracities you went as a speaker and a judge to the finals, right? So how did this dual perspective like change you? Because judging sometimes, as I refer to, helps a lot with your speaking journey because simply it makes you a better speaker. And then being a speaker also helps you become a better judge. But is that true for you? And do you believe that it's something that's going to be important for you?
It has been true for me. I definitely think that more people should judge a lot more because then they would understand a lot more what judges' frustrations are. Like I know a lot of speakers, for example, like get salty at the wrong call and that sort of stuff. But I feel if you judge consistently and crucially you judge frequently enough to try and meaningfully get better at judging, you'll realize some really big intractable problems in the way teams engage with each other. So for example, like teams have a tendency to counter argue against each other versus actually respond. So, for example, to be more specific, you won't say something like, here is their argument, and here are two reasons why it's wrong. Instead, what you really are saying is like, here is their argument, here is why the opposite claim of their argument is true, and here are two different reasons for it. And the difference between both of these things is like in step one, they will give an argument, they will give two reasons why their argument is true, and you attack their reasons. People don't do this much anymore now, sadly. People instead sort of say, here is their argument, and they give two reasons. I will give the opposite argument, and here are my two reasons why it's true. Let's be specific. So, like, let's say, I don't know, like, this supports privatization or something like that, right? Of like some public industry. So, Gov will say, privatization is good because private companies are short term compared to governments for these two reasons. Opposition, instead of saying, here is why those two reasons they give are wrong, will instead say, no, 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 no. We flip this. Here is why governments are more are more long term than private companies for these two other reasons. And now, as a judge, you're like sort of like scratching your head because you have these two random reasons from two different teams, and you now, as a judge, are left to intervene or weigh how these reasons come about. So, basic problems like these can crop up a lot. And you will often recognize them a lot more when you judge because you will realize that weighing counter arguments is a real skill as a speaker that speakers do not give enough credit to. So instead of say weighing competing reasons, instead of trying to be detailed in explaining why one reason is right or wrong, they will just respond vaguely by just counter arguing. Another simple problem is like comparatives, for example, right? So a team will give a reason that on face sounds like it's comparative, but isn't really very comparative. So like they will say something like, governments, like I don't know, for example, private companies are more short term than governments because private companies are really beholden to shareholder interests. So every quarter you have to publish a new report, and thus private companies are really bad. End of argument. A very simple problem here, which is that any reasonable opportunity company, no, 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 no. Governments are super short term because they have electoral cycles. So they may have like every 2 years, for example, they have to really like cater to their local electorate because I don't know, regional elections in their state may happen then, or like every 3 years, depending on which country you're from, they'll have to be replaced themselves. Now, I guess there is a way of weighing this in this instance, which is you can try and just say like, yeah, I don't know, like every 3 months is probably more short term than every 2 years. But the point I'm trying to make is like teams don't recognize that their argument isn't directly comparative, and that's because they don't stress test it themselves. Again, a very easy skill you will learn if you judge a lot more, because part of judging is like you can't accept everything at face value. If you do that, then whoever gets the last word just ends up auto winning. So like anything they can say, any random crap they can say will just pass. Obviously, as a judge, you can't do that, but the real art is figuring out when and where to intervene and when and where the intervention seems reasonable. So, like, when is an argument quote unquote reasonable? When is an argument not reasonable? These are like difficult and sometimes impossible questions to judge. But part of the thing that helps with speaking is that if you as a judge recognize that you need to sometimes intervene or say like this extension doesn't seem reasonable because it doesn't meet this burden, you then become better as a speaker because now when you're speaking, you're like, okay, I know what the judge wants, let me cater to that. So some of those sort of things can be really simple, like other things I'll give a brief indication of, like clear impacting, establishing a very significant margin of change, weighing all of these things. You just become a bit better as a speaker because you realize that's what the judge looks for. Very hard to do because if all you do is just speak, you have a very like myopic view of what your speech is, but and just listening with what that speech is. But to get that judge's perspective, it's much more helpful to do as a judge. That's why, like, so the way it's affected me directly is it's affected what I do as a speaker. So, for example, I am more comfortable with strategy, I've noticed, that most speakers I tend to debate against because I usually have like idea as to here's the strategy I want to go for. My problems instead can sometimes be like I occasionally, because I tend to speak slowly, can miss burdens because I think that saying one slow, clear sentence that's very intuitive is enough to meet the burden. So I sometimes like can like bite more than I can chew. I can like run a lot more arguments than I probably should. I can refute a lot more than I probably should. So like my problems, for example, don't tend to be like, or the other problem I sometimes face is argument generation, like especially if in BP format, because I'm used to as a judge just like passively listening to arguments and critically analyzing them. But as a speaker, I have to like actually make the arguments, right? I have to like start the generation myself, which can seem a bit like intimidating. So it's definitely influenced what I do. Like me as a judge has made my speaking a bit better. I think it's strategic. And me as a speaker has hopefully at my best meant that when I'm judging, I'm a little bit more sympathetic to the problems of speakers. So it means, for example, when I'm giving feedback, usually I think a lot of judges they give feedback in terms of here is what you did wrong, but aren't as good at telling you here are the steps you can take to improve at that skill. or here are the things you can do to not make that error again. Easier to do again if you spend some time speaking.
Yeah, I think the major problem here comes around that when we have that sort of disjoint between, say, judging and speaking, there's a lot more conflict which happens between the judges and the speakers, because the speakers are often like, oh, this is not really a fair judge. This judge really
Mhm.
marks me down in tournaments, and that happens a lot in, say, the Indian circuit as well, or maybe in some other circuits as well. But then that becomes a huge challenge in terms of saying that we do not have good judges, because good judges inherently need to be at least experienced as speakers to a certain degree, but that's very often missing. So I think you do hit the nail on the head when you say that there is a lot more need for us to have good speakers being good judges and good judges being good speakers, and that's something which is going to be beneficial. But a very easy transition from this conversation comes to the fact that you mentioned something around adjudication course, balancing everything out and making a tournament more holistic. So, as somebody who's been part of, say, an adjudication panel, core adjudication panel at various tournaments, as well as a deputy core in various tournaments, what do you think makes this adjudication core fair and competitive, and what are their responsibilities and roles like?
Yeah, so there are a lot of different priorities. So so one priority is with judges and the logistical things of organizing the tournament, and the other one which is just with like motions and that sort of stuff. So it also depends on whether it's an online or an in-person competition. So for example, in an online competition, it's a little easier, obviously, the logistics, because you just have to like do everything over Discord, over like Taptastic, and over like Zoom. Um, if it's like a reasonable competition, sometimes you make changes. Like you use the Google Meet, so you use something else. But the main priorities are one with judges. So this means, for example, ensuring that forms are sent for judges to like put in information on time, like uh, get a list of judges' scores and try and make rankings out of those scores. So this means putting in your own scores by ranking in judges' CVs. If you need to have a judge test, making that judge test and figuring out what that looks like, figuring out the percentage of the judge test versus the judge scores, creating a base score for that judge, and then once the competition starts, like figuring out which judges you want to break. So that will involve like some process of like one preforming panels on Taptastic. So it'll be like like on Tabbycat, sorry, or like what exactly is the like what are the panels going to look like? So in the early rounds you can just maybe auto allocate it on the software, but in later rounds you will have to like more manually make interventions. Sort of like we need to check this judge because their feedback dropped, or like this judge is good. Maybe we can consider them for chairing a higher round. So some of these deliberations start coming in place. So you may theoretically do something where like you will have higher judges judging in better rooms as chairs, or as in later rounds, higher judges not judging always better rooms but judging more live rooms, i.e. rounds where like like a single, like a third or a fourth place could determine whether that team breaks or not. And you want those rooms to have the best judges, because quite obviously those are the rooms that are most at stake. So like even at the top room, like probably more a fair percentage of the time, all the four teams will break if it's a large enough competition. So that may not have as good a judge as compared to middle rooms where the break could be very determinative. So some of these adjudications you make a lot. So the skills that the team needs at the time, the core needs, is one, I would say, like time management and organization. The main thing I always know is like reach out as early as possible to Orcom, to Tab, to Equity, figure things out as much as possible, and also like be willing to like be proactive. So I feel like what like I think what cores are not very good at, I think, is they're good at sort of like doing the minimal skills that they are assigned, so the minimal duties they're assigned, but they don't take the proactive step of like reaching out and trying to get things done. So this means, for example, it's the difference between, say, a CAP member like reaching out and saying, "Hey, Orcom, is this been done?" Or like, "Is the Discord ready?" For example, or have links been sent out, or to Equity, like, "Is this being done? Like, has this been done?" So sometimes you need to actively reach out and take the mental load of organizing things. If you don't take the mental load of organizing things, then you can have like a bystander effect where everyone thinks everyone else is doing something, and then suddenly they realize a couple of days before the comp, like, actually many of these important things have not been done. And this has happened before, right? And it's especially easy, I think, as a college student to make that error, because let's face it, this is one part of your life. The other part of your life is like college stuff, like getting your classes done and all that shit. So a lot of the admin skills is like an art. It's a thing that comes about by being good at organizing. So having a timetable there, having a list of tasks and duties, reaching out to people on time, reaching out early if you can, sometimes it also involves like being good at conflict resolution. So for example, being willing to sometimes step on people's toes. If an Orcom member isn't doing their job or isn't doing well, obviously like don't be an asshole and like start shouting at them or something like that or being harsh. But it does mean saying like, hey, is this being done? Or like trying to take some of the weight out of them, like, let us do this, something, let's be proactive. So examples of this might be like there have been competitions where, for example, we have reached out and done some of the basic registration for teams ourselves. Not technically a CA duty, but a thing has to be done for the competition to run. Now we could play the blame game of like your role, you do the role, my role, I do the role. Or at some point in time, we start accepting that look, we're running out of time. Let's just get this stuff done. So that's one part of it. Um, this means that some CA teams are good at some things versus not. For example, some CAP members are really good at doing the judging part of it. So they're very good at keeping track of judges throughout the competition. Which judge needs to be checked when? What is judges' feedbacks looking like? Creating panels and that sort of stuff, right? Or some judges are very good at like the software part of it. Like I can preform a panel on TabbyCap. I can input equity clashes when I need to. Those sort of stuff. And some are just good at like the proactive stuff of organizing. Like for an in-person tournament, right? Like, okay, is the venue set? Is food coming in? These people have these are so equity concerns. Like sometimes these roles blend a little bit into each other. You try and keep a clear division, obviously. Like obviously, for example, CAP should not be doing equity roles because there's a conflict of interest there. But like sometimes, like some things happen. Like a CA member may do a tab thing, it just ends up happening. So that's one part of it. The other really big part of it is motion testing. I think for better or for worse, I feel most CAPs sadly have not been as good at this as they can be. And the main thing about this is being methodical and recognizing you just have to put in a lot of work. Because especially in British parliamentary, ensuring that motions are good takes a long time. There are very few people, in my opinion, who have like the gift for just making a good motion quickly. So what I think CA teams usually do is what they'll do is they sort of say like, okay, let's put in motions. They'll put in motions into an Excel sheet or whatever. They'll meet one day and they'll just rank them individually and then say above a certain cutoff, say like I don't know, 3 out of 5 stars. They will just discuss those motions. They will make a rough list, and then maybe what they'll do is like each person is assigned to stress test it. And then in the next session, they'll just read the stress test and they'll make the final set list from that. In theory, this should work, but there are usually a number of fail points, right? So, for example, people, or I think a lot of people are not very good at writing down stress tests. So they may skip a stress test because they run out of time. Or when they write it, they would write it in a very like problematic way. So what, for example, is that instead of taking the time out to think, are these arguments that we think top half will take? Or is this a complete argument, or have I just broken one argument down into 3 different steps and call them 3 different arguments? These are very different things, right? So, in an ideal world, what you were doing is you're sort of saying, here is what I think are reasonable, complete arguments a good top half will take. Is there genuine extension material after that? Or another question is, I understand that in theory, Gov have 4 arguments, Op have 4 arguments. But are these 4 arguments genuinely as strong as each other? Are both of these arguments somewhat intuitive? Because if one side is a bit more unintuitive than the other, obviously we would, in theory, love to have a perfect set of judges across the competition. In reality, that isn't going to happen, no matter how good your pool is. So you want you want both sides to be intuitive enough that at least in most mid rooms, a bad judge will not screw or fuck you over, right? Like, obviously, you want a motion that's balanced enough that it's still somewhat accessible to others. Or other basic questions, right? Like, is this motion accessible enough to some extent? So sometimes we would test, like, what might the debate look like in a poor room? What might it look like in a mid room? What might it look like in a top room? And can we expect reasonably deep or balanced debates in all of those 3 rooms, right? Other questions. Is the motion clear? Do we need to change motion wording a little bit? Do we need to like preempt like what might clarifications to this motion look like, right? So all of these are important considerations to take. And in an ideal world, I think what CAP members should be doing is that they should be rigorously stress testing the motions, and each person should be deeply reading over the other teams, like over the other judges' stress test. So, for example, no matter how excellent the other CAP members might be, they might have a bad day. They might be busy. They might not have enough time for it. Their stress test may not be so good. And some judges, I'm sorry to say, some CAP members are just not very good at stress testing. It's fine, like different CAP have different skills. So that means you have to take it onto yourself to, for example, do things like read up all of their stress tests properly and say, is this an actually good stress test? Are there arguments that are being missed? Is this three arguments or is this just one argument? Is this like coherent or clear? All these questions you ought to be asking. So in some instances, for example, I have straight up on my own time just written up stress tests for every motion that's there in our shortlist, not just the motions I've been assigned. So I might be assigned 3 out of the 15 motions because there are 5 cap and each of them are assigned 3. Sometimes it takes more time, yeah, but like you want a good motion set. And like generally the rewards of a good motion set are like quite enormous. Like it's good reputation at the bare minimum. So like people think this is a good cap member. Like who will like if they are on cap, I'm happy to sign up for this competition because I'm expecting reasonable, deep, balanced motions. Sometimes it's like I'm going to get fun or interesting motions with this cap, and that's a cool thing. So I would sign up for it. If you have friends, they will sometimes actively compliment you on it. They'll be like, "This is a really cool set," and some of them are not even your friends. They may just be friendly people, right? So, like at my best, some people have complimented me who I've just had like one or two conversations with. That seems great, and I think, frankly speaking, a lot of times when people are speakers, like when I'm speaker and I like a motion set, I often have genuinely complimented team members, like CAP members on it, because why the hell not, right? I mean, like it's something I enjoyed. Like let's face it, a lot of us who are doing this online could be hopefully we could be touching grass instead, right? We could be meeting friends, we could be like doing things, or maybe we're just having a terrible weekend and just like doing a lot of homework. But the point is we're making some minimal sacrifice, some opportunity cost through debate competitions. So why not acknowledge it when it's done well? So this is the other really big job for a CAP member: getting good motions that are deep, interesting, balanced, novel, right? Like not just stock ones that are always redone. A lot of priorities to balance. So take the time out and do that. So that's the other big thing that CAP members ought to be good at. So the organization bit, the judging bit, and the motion bit. Those are the 3 bits to do. And then yeah, like there are other priorities, like out rounds, for example, like allocating judges, keeping things running to time, I think is really, really important. Lot of priorities. But yeah.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. I think being experienced is very important, in these roles per se, but also I think one that you have to also accept your shortcomings a lot, because I've felt in my own experiences when I've been part of a core panel or anything, there have been a lot of tangents drawn towards conflict rather than resolution, and that becomes something of a realistic problem that we need to deal with as well. But very insightful. Just coming on to the
Mhm.
last few questions in this segment, I think one, when you mentioned that you've been a debate coach and you have had opportunities to train students from the UAE and Taiwan to WSDC breaks, what would you say would be your, say, first thing that you say to them to improve, or a couple of things that you refer to them to do better? And how does your experience with debate coaching pan out in its entirety?
I'll answer the first one because I think it's a little bit more easy to answer. The second one's really like another long ranty answer for me. To the first one, so I mean, I can talk specifically about my time, which means that I can talk about the trends that I see in speaking. So usually, in my opinion, the trends I've seen in speaking is it's unfortunate, but I feel it's maybe been changing a little bit in the last year. But a lot of the societies I've trained often had some struggles with either one of two things. Well, I guess UAE and Taiwan had very different experiences because when I started with UAE, UAE, they were basically novices, like the kids. Like they had done very little prior debating and they had done very little bit in WSDC format. So a lot of it was just getting their rigor up to speed. What they were good at was style. So they had style for freaking days. Like UAE, for better or worse, unfortunately, by that time, UAE had a reputation as like, the like hollow cases, like stylistically like very nice, but like the actual case just seems like there's very little in it, or like it wasn't well made. Um, and that's why I think, unfortunately, UE sort of been missing out on the breaks for like a long time. They hadn't broken in WCC for a while. So my job was to just get the basic rigor in place. So I would just walk them through stuff like, here are the steps involved in making an argument. Here's what a reset might look like. Here are how the burdens might play out. Here's a clear impact you have to access. When you respond to other teams, here is what you have to focus on when you're responding to them. So those would be a lot of the basic building blocks and walk them through. So like at the basic level, the first things I would tell them was something like, here are the steps involved in an argument. So I would just lay it as something like, you need a thesis statement, perhaps. Um, you want to give like, here are the links involved in making the argument. Usually the links work in a flow. So step A leads to step B leads to step C. At each step, there may be one or two reasons you provide. I would usually say you don't need to give more than one or two reasons for any one step. That's because often teams have a tendency to provide three or four reasons for one step and then miss out the next step entirely. So it's better to have a full, complete argument rather than like miss a step and just like over mechanize one step. Something like that. Have a clear one or two impacts that you're going for, and that's the argument. When you're responding to them, you don't always need to give three or four responses. You can just give one or two responses, and that's fine. So those would be some things, and then I just be like just walking them through what these steps. So like, here's a motion. What do you think the main clash in this or this speech might look like? So what do you think Gov will argue? What do you think Op will argue? Do you have any thoughts on how you want to break those deadlocks? What might that winning look like? So that would be the situation with UAE. Taiwan was a very different story because these kids were pretty experienced in the sense that they've been speaking for a long time, but they're also not broken at words for quite a while, unfortunately. And I think their reasoning was a bit more different. The reasoning was sort of more like, there's a tendency, I think, where if you debate for a bit too long without deeply thinking into it, you could just run into making stock arguments really, really quickly without acknowledging whether A, those stock arguments are directly working for this motion, B, whether your responses are directly working for their case, and C, whether your entire speech is understandable enough to a judge. Because often, especially at that time, speakers would speak really fast. Like the online era was at its peak. And while I think for the most part in university, people who spoke pretty fast were still pretty good at either making things or still pretty good at finding a way to be like sounding understandable. WSDC people would sort of do like a B or a C grade version of like these university speakers. So they do like a worse version of this, which is just like they would speak fast. They got that down. They would run a lot of arguments, but most of the arguments would be incomplete at different stages. They would miss something. They would like not have a clear impact. And so then a judge like who isn't like deeply into the circuit would just be like, what the hell am I hearing? I can't track half of it. I don't understand the half that I have tracked. And I'm not sure whether this is perceptually beating the other team. Very harmful to teams like Taiwan, who didn't have a ton of reputation at the time. So for them, a lot of the stuff I had to work on was already stuff like style-based things, like speak slowly, pick one response and sell it, pick one argument and sell it, how to do meta weighing for one argument versus another. Those were a lot of the skills I had to work with now, and those were often the skills I would be like, those are the first things I'd be telling them to. So it can be pretty team dependent. And my usual feeling is that it is not as helpful to try and have like generalizable, like, here are XY things that I can tell to whichever newbie that comes across. That can exist, obviously, depending on the level. But it's far more helpful, in my opinion, to try and be as tailored as you can as early as possible. You have a couple of months, you have a few months to train them, right from the get go. Here are a couple of debates, understand what their common problems are, and then try really hard to start honing it in. And that sometimes would mean creating your own drills for those speakers, creating your own sort of like tips and tricks for those teams, like trying to like gamify or create situations where they are testing their unique skills. Sometimes isolate a skill and have them train hard on it. So like India would do this, I think, a bit better, for a while. So yeah, those were really like the main things to do, which is that instead of always having a like, here are the main things immediately people have to work on. That can help, but it's helpful to first understand who the people you're actually talking about are.
Couple of things were very interesting in what you were mentioning around the onus of changing the shape of debating in different spaces, right? And how you also see that there is a perceptive error, or maybe say a requirement to approach things differently, especially when you were mentioning the case of the children in UAE and Taiwan as well when you were training them for WSDC. So in this final segment, let's just move on towards just your ideas about how the shape of debating might be in the future, or what other global dynamics and societal effects have had on debating in general, right? So the first thing that I would like to discuss a bit about you is that what do you think is the next thing that is going to happen in competitive debating? It might be something very minuscule, it might be something much more major that you believe might be there, but what do you think will emerge as a trend?
Hmm. I mean, there are a few things like or challenges that have already started. So a big, I think, challenge that people have been having now is say like what the rise of AI or Chat GPT is doing with it. So for example, like part of the most basic level is like cheating allegations or like whether people are going to check things up online during a speech. And now especially they can generate arguments wholesale. So obviously attempts to combat that have been rising, but that's also I think having impacts on the kinds of arguments or the way people are running arguments are. The other thing that's influences is like the rise of things like matter file, the general awareness people are having earlier on as to what stock arguments and what stock clashes are within debates itself. And what I think that means is that A, there is a risk of either teams like running stock material a lot earlier without careful thought as to whether the specific intricacies of this motion apply to that stock as well. And the other thing is that so this can happen in worse rooms where like people just run stock without deeply thinking about it. And the other part is in good rooms, unfortunately, people just run all the stock well earlier on. So then there can seem like a surface, like a lack of good argumentation, either if you're on closing or something like that, right? Which is again part of the reason why I think 3v3 is like as a whole a fairer format because you don't have to worry as much about that. The debate just boils down to characterization clashes and how you deal with those characterization clashes, how you weigh within them. Um, so I think that'll probably be a trend that increases, which is people will run stock, either they'll run it badly or they'll run it well. And both of those may pose some challenges, like how do you create innovative arguments and from where? What might innovative motions or interesting motions look like? Like I feel generally like I've seen so many debates, so I feel like I know like a lot of stock clashes pretty easily. And that can lead to people feeling jaded a little earlier. So that's one problem I feel I've noticed a little bit. The other thing that I think I feel will happen a little bit more um, uh, in debating is probably like, well, this is a fear, I suppose. I hope it doesn't happen or I hope it changes. But I feel that debating has probably become, in some ways, a lot more inaccessible than it used to be. Um, there was a sudden spike in accessibility with the rise of COVID, for better or for worse. Like I would say, in many ways, it's for the better because obviously there's a rise of online competitions. Many people across different circuits in the world can participate, and probably it also was a bit like difficult because so many people it felt that they couldn't go to in-person competitions anymore, and that's obviously a very important part of going to debate, right? The community you can form, the fun things you can do with friends outside of this debate. Um, but now probably in some ways we've moved a little bit like too harsh into the other direction. Like Panama Worlds, for example, had just like 52 rooms. And like it's a huge drop down from like prior worlds when you used to have like 90 plus rooms. Like I was looking up recently, like Thailand, which is prior, like 2020 worlds, which is prior to when COVID hit, like had like 95 plus rooms, right? And like wholesale continents were locked out of it. So like Africa, like I think like two teams came. Like Asia, like a couple of teams came, right? Like almost none of them from South Asia. So this is a trend I fear will worsen unless there are very big steps to take place. And the reason it's going to worsen is because, well, one, there's obviously a risk of the circuit that ends up winning the bid to host worlds just being inaccessible, right? Like my passport's still an Indian passport. And that obviously is like a much weaker than average passport. And mine is still, like I would say, among the stronger passports of the weak team, of the weak nation's passports. Like getting visas on time, getting them without paying a lot of money, really freaking hard, right? Obviously. The other thing is like sponsorships have been drying up. I think I feel this started with Madrid. Like it's just really hard to get companies to sponsor debating competitions like they used to before. And so that often means like there's just less and less money to subsidize reg waivers, to subsidize flight costs, which are pretty expensive for a lot of teams. So unless there are like very big active measures, I fear and suspect that debating will go back to being like quite inaccessible, where wholesale continents can't go to the top European or like competitions or the top world's competitions. Um, I think there are some measures that have tried to help a little bit. So, for example, there was like a big call out, I think, a year or two ago against Oxford IB for having really high reg fees and like basically providing very little in terms of food and like good crash. I've heard it's been better as a result of that. But this probably is going to have to be like a little bit more of an intensive set of call outs over there. I think it's starting. I hope it continues. I just am a pessimist and expect it to get worse before it gets better. But like, I, for example, seen call outs of the 2027 bids, like a lot more questions of the Almaty and the Ottawa and the Schwalbe bids about whether they are accessible towards visas, whether there are sponsorships provided. And I hope that these sorts of conversations happen a lot more. And even if that means that we're not going to have like many competitions, like world's competitions, say in like really in countries with really bad visa regimes, I'm fine with that, because at least that means that many more teams get to participate in whatever future worlds looks like. And let's face it, like worlds is like it still is kind of the peak, worlds, Euros, some of the European competitions. For better or for worse, the rep isn't breaking down anytime soon. So like increasing accessibility is going to become pretty important. But those are the two trends I expect are happening.
I think I can reflect a bit on my personal journey also on what you say, because when there was COVID, regrettably being such a global pandemic and such a big problem for different people in different walks of life, it however did allow me to do a lot more international tournaments, interveracities and all, which were opening up for me. So that gave me more access. But then the moment that those dried up and started going offline again, it became problem for me to access through India because of the visa regime problems that you were saying, and also the flight costs and other waivers that were potentially missing from these competitions as well. So I think that that's a very important way in which we sort of see problems, right? But I think the second segment
Mhm.
that comes around from here is when you're thinking that debate formats are evolving and changing and there are certain problems, but there are also a lot of conversations which happen in debate spaces around, say, global changes and societal changes. So thinking about these changing global dynamics and society links, what do you think would be the future of debating? Because people keep changing, say, the format of speeches change in a certain way because of, say, certain conflicts have certain themes coming up on debate more, like for example the Ukraine conflict and the other issues that come around in the world. So do you think society does play a very important, and changing global dynamics play an important narrative in debating?
I mean, that always like trend tends to reflect what's happening latest in society. So, for example, I don't know, like there are a lot more motions this year and last year about say like the rise of right wing, like politicians or like populist politicians across a wide variety of nations, and that's obviously reflecting real world dynamics in South America, in Asia, in Europe, obviously the United States. Yeah, I won't mention a certain specific president. So like the point is that like obviously it's increasing, and so that obviously is very important effects on the emotions you have. I've seen a lot of increase in immigration debates over the past year to try and account for these sorts of things. um the other thing is, in some ways it's, I'd say in a lot of ways it's for the better, in some ways maybe for the worse, but most of the time it's for the better, which is that like debating has also broken, I think, a bit of like the liberal bubble bias that used to exist a lot before. So for example, there probably was an excessive like tendency to for like at least I would say within like Western debate circuits to like be a little bit intolerant towards like perspectives that were, I think, a bit more realistic, which is that like I don't know, many people, for example, are not pro immigration, and there are like reasonable rational reasons why they may not be. And I say this as someone who is an immigrant myself, right? So like stuff like this, or like economics that isn't always going to be like super left wing, but like sometimes we want a lot more economic growth. So a lot of these sorts of things have like improved a lot more over the past few years, and that's in part, I think, because the world is having some kind of like, so I would say mostly for the worse, but like in some ways for the better, like a right wing backlash towards what society looks like. I mean, a basic example is the world's final of this year. So like the team that won, closing government, basically won on an argument that said that like populism is generally good for democracy, right? I would argue this is an argument that would be a lot harder or unintuitive to conceptualize like a few years ago, when when societies were like, when people were really like more liberal, when like Me Too and BLM stuff were happening a lot more. And even that was, for example, a reaction to other like prior right-wing excesses in the past. So then we suddenly had a lot more social justice motions about like Me Too and BLM and that sort of stuff. So I think definitely that's happening a lot more. In terms of what future trends might look like, I mean, I don't know. There's no way I feel to talk about this without thinking about my own biases and what I think the world issues of today are. But for example, I think like it depends. Some of them are noticeable for their lack of motions about it. For example, like Israel Palestine, there have definitely been some motions about it, but I don't think the number of motions has kept pace with how serious or important the world issue is. And that's because, for better or for worse, there's a lot of controversy on both sides in terms of what is a nuanced and reasonable way to talk about this issue, and not run the risk of like being too hot politicky, or like being super controversial, or like risking backlash from some circuits, whatever that is going to look like. So that has sometimes happened. The other thing I suspect will happen a lot more is like climate change stuff. I think there's recently been like a spate of news, both with like the wildfires that are happening in LA right now, but also I feel like what people are recognizing is that there were a lot of wildfires happening in 2024 across South America and like Central Africa that were not talked about in the news. There will probably be a lot more, like hopefully, motions about those. So yeah, definitely there'll be a lot of those about that. The interesting thing is, what are people's general perspectives on it? So debating obviously skews young, where most of us are college students or like just a bit older than those. So probably like my experience, at least from the people I talk to, is that people are generally fairly pessimistic about things improving or things changing, or things getting a lot better. And that often has infected the way they make arguments. For example, like making arguments about how people are very self-interested or politicians are like very self-interested is considered very, very intuitive. But them being altruistic is a much harder step to make. Unless the altruistic action is as a result of self-interested tendencies, i.e., I don't know, like you have to provide economic growth because you fear protests or something like that, right? So that's been a trend that's been existing for a while over the past few years. I suspect that's only going to increase in the future. Like, I think people are going to be even more skeptical of people in power or figures of authority, um, that they are like not very self-interested. That probably for better or for worse, like a lot more rural individuals aren't like in some ways having racial or sexist biases, stuff like that. I suspect that's going to be increasing because debating is still going to skew liberal. Like most of us are college students. Like 7% of the world only has a college education. So clearly, the people who do debate are not like a general representation of society. We are clearly like, for the most part, a relatively more privileged perspective on what society looks like. But that does mean, for better or for worse, we have like a view on what society is. That's probably a bit more pessimistic. Hopefully, more educated with facts. Sometimes more, I would say for the most part, probably is, but I'm biased because like friends and family people I talk to who are not in debate, like, oh boy, some of the things they say. So I think that's what the trends are going to be. It's probably going to be more pessimistic. Going to talk about some of those issues a little.
So regrettably, we're getting very short on time, so I'll just be ending with this last question. It was very interesting to have this conversation. But just as we end, what's next for you in debate, and what do you think is something that we missed out on that you would like to share?
Nothing like super important. I could just yap forever, so I just won't do that. I think we covered most of the important stuff. To the former, I mean, I don't know. So I'm probably just gonna try and like judge and speak at different competitions. So like now, February, March in North America, the West Coast is suddenly like getting like, ramping up some of its competitions. There's like a couple in California that I probably will try and judge. USUDCs, that United States Universities Debating Championship. So that's like the second largest major in North America. Um, that's probably going to be happening. So that's going to be happening. So I'll probably go for that. So that is going to be pretty exciting. Um, the other stuff is like in WSDC, it's like tricky. I'm gonna try and see if I can still remain involved in it. One of the tough things about holding a job full time while trying to do this is like it's really hard to do it, especially if like the country you're trying to do coaching for is in a very different time zone. But I'm gonna try and do it. Hopefully, I'll be able to attend WSDC, but I don't know. It's a little bit tough to say because I have some visa stamping issues that need to get sorted out before I can leave the country. Since I'm still an immigrant in this great nation. And then the other thing is hopefully I'll try and attend Worlds this December. Like actually, I did the online Worlds in 2022, but I've not actually attended the in-person WUDCs after that because of like visa issues, and I had like some personal problems in 2024 with my father. So um I had to deal to those, but hopefully in 2026 I'll actually be able to attend a WUDC in person for the first time in a while. It's very much a strong priority because I do feel if I've done so many things in this community that I feel I should try to at least do my best to attend the world. It's important enough to my identity that I should just go for that. So hopefully I'll do that. But yeah, I'll see. I'll try. I'll keep judging. Probably I'll keep seeing. I'll try and do some of the summer rounds of competition that we're speaking at. I tend to have a lot of speaker anxiety, so I've not done it a lot in past years, but I'm going to try and do it a lot more this year. And yeah, keep doing the same things. I probably like I'll try and do like maybe one or two competitions a month. I usually tend not to do more than that because I just have like a whole life now that's non-debate. I just because I work, I do things now. So it's a lot harder, I feel, to be involved in the debating circuit once you're like having a full-time like big boy working job or a big girl working job, whatever. So yeah, but I'm gonna keep trying.
That sounds pretty interesting, Pranav. Thank you so much for joining in. It was very insightful. You shared a lot for your experiences in international debate tournaments, and I'm pretty sure people judging or speaking or in any format getting into debate would have a lot of insights to gain from it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much. Thanks for the questions.